Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the panel on investments, insurance, and lending. It's a broad topic, which can probably need several conferences of its own. But it's not too loud, I can hear myself. Okay. In the 40 minutes we have here, we try to at least cover superficially and hopefully maybe in as much time we can dive a little deeper into some of these topics. I'm going to let my fellow panelists introduce themselves, starting with Sara.
Thanks. I'm Sara Eckhouse. I'm Executive Director of FoodShot Global. We are a nonprofit collaborative consortium with an integrated capital platform. So we have a prize of over $500,000 for research, policy and advocacy work, and early stage entrepreneurship. And then we also have a venture capital of up to $10 million via our venture partners. So we have about 20 partners at this point, including Mars, the Rockefeller Foundation, S2G Ventures, a number of other funds, the Nature Conservancy, and we have a challenge that we launch each year. So our inaugural challenge was focused on innovating in soil health, and we'll be launching our second challenge in the coming months.
Maja, Vujinovic, OGroup. We're an investor and an advisor. We've been in a variety of spaces. My background is I'm a former hacker, an investor in telecom, and from there worked across Africa and Latin America, investing in agriculture, energy, and healthcare. Really the focus is scale and growth for us, and we help companies and VC firms and investment firms focus on particularly difficult aspects of scaling in emerging markets and work with government and local farmers.
Hi, I'm Cristina Rohr. I'm an investor with S2G Ventures. S2G is a venture capital fund investing across the food value chain, effectively soil to shelf. We have about 45 companies that we're invested in that are focused on solving key global issues that pertain to food system, human health, environmental issues. We have a collaborative investment approach. We invest alongside foundations, universities, other corporate funds, and we believe this collaborative approach is essential to drive long-term change in the food system.
Cool. So I'm Ingrid Fung with Finistere Ventures. We're an agricultural technology investment fund based out of California. Our investment focus is strictly in tech that applies to agriculture and food. So that's everything across the value chain from biotech traits all the way over to software and sensors, insurance company platforms for agriculture and food ingredients. So my background's in plant molecular bio, so I'm a scientist that kind of wandered into the finance front. And I cover off most of our life sciences, crop inputs type investments.
Perfect. Well, good afternoon. My name is Joe Young. I'm the president and co-founder of Growers Edge Financial. We're not a technology builder. We don't do sensors. We don't do seed technology. But what we do focus on is helping the farmers, the growers, improve the return on their investment by helping declutter some of the noise that's out there and help them have confidence in making those decisions, and then helping them finance so they can transition their farm a lot faster. Glad to be with you.
Well, let's kick it off by start talking about trends in investing or trends in what you're looking to invest in. Is there a specific mandate or thesis that you have moving forward into next year? It's a question for anybody, really.
Well, our mandate and our mission is to catalyze innovation for a healthy, sustainable, equitable food system. And we're really looking for those transformational technologies, tools, and approaches that will enable a kind of sea change in our food system, not just the stepwise changes. So, things that we're looking for should be investable and scalable, globally relevant. So I think that distinguishes us somewhat. And then we also have this collaborative model. So we're looking at even, very early stage innovation that we can then take through our capital continuum, starting with the prize, and then move them up to through blended finance models through the venture opportunities.
Talk a bit more about the geography of it, and Maja, maybe this is a good question for you. You have a lot of experience internationally with investing. Is there something trendy in different places, or how are you guys viewing agriculture globally, or what to invest in?
Yeah, it's a loaded question, and I think a lot of different people have different experiences here, but I definitely see, for example, I've spent over 12 years in Africa and Latin America, and there's been such huge attempts to make some of the land workable and produce food, because there is shortage of food in some of these places. But you see the kind of rising trend, and then you see the money come in and then either get lost or it takes a long time to actually produce something at scale. Also, what we've seen, there's a trend that will come in with particularly technology or something, and some of the examples are in risk management or in insurance, that will come in emerging markets, particularly like in Brazil, when you see a lot of the soy or a lot of grains. The reality is that impact on some of these farmers, when you trickle it down, there isn't as much impact that we can show for. So then depends what your investment thesis is. We are not a typical VC fund. We've been very opportunistic across the board, across technologies, and across verticals. But for me, what's important, if you're asking that, in some of these markets, if I look at emerging markets, then it's the actual impact of that agricultural investment, the way you are treating the soil and how you're preparing it for future crops as well, Are you just going to do it one time and destroy it and then having a hard time planting again? In the Western world is different, I'm looking at more packaged goods. And I think, for example, goods from West Africa are going to be trends in 2020 that you're going to start seeing more, Fridge-based packaged foods I'm looking at specifically. Butters, different types of butters that are going to come out. Those are more consumer, off shelves, ready stuff. Also in the West, I'm quite concerned with what's in our food. So, for example, we had an opportunity to invest in Impossible Burger, but one of the reasons that we've decided not to, again, that was you could say, dumb financial decision, but in another sense, we don't know the effects of that on our health, And so our decision was no, So it depends what your thesis is, but yeah, that's how I would think about it.
It's a good thing to bring up, and maybe Cristina, you could talk a little bit about this, is that with a lot of these new technologies, there comes a lot of risks, and being able to sort of predict the future of what will be the knock-on effects of certain things. Is that something you guys look at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we look at agriculture in particular, we believe that a lot of the problems that are inherent in agriculture relate to data and reliability of data, the ability to interpret and make actionable decisions on the data. And when we look at these technologies, we work a lot with Joe and Grower's Edge. What his company does is interpreting this data and using this data in financial models. What that translates into is mitigating some of the risks, for example, from the farmer's perspective. So if you want to try a new technology, then Grower's Edge could provide a warranty model that encourages that adoption. Layer that in the data science aspect to that, what that translates into is better decisions, better sustainability, and ultimately better outcomes for the food system.
Yeah, I think on the efficacy and adoption front, farmers aren't stupid, As we heard this morning from Kevin, we're placing a lot of undue pressure and responsibility when it comes to, getting to sustainability goals on our producers. And what we fail to really understand is how thin the margins are for farmers now, Most farmers are borrowing against their land in order to have operating capital during their season. And what this means for them is when they're taking risks and trying new technologies, it's not that they don't want to adopt them, but if you think about, if you're making a business decision that can result in your family losing the land that they may have been working for 3 or 4 generations, that weighs pretty heavily on people. And this is why, having not only novel technologies that, improve sustainability effectively is important, but having tools for risk mitigation against, literally losing your home is paramount in driving towards improved farming practices.
And I fully agree with that. And I think this may be a good segue into Joe talking about how you saw some of those farmer problems and some of the thin margins that Ingrid was talking about.
I think it's perfect in how it's progressed. My background, my entire career has been in risk management, insurance, financial services. And when we started this company, we said we have to do things different. And that's a theme that's resonating throughout this entire summit, is what does the future look like? And so many different speakers have talked about the amount of capital. That's what you do. You're deploying capital, all of which is trying to get a grower to embrace it, to adopt it. And so you can imagine this line of all of these great technologies, some mediocre, some poor, all trying to knock on the farm gate of the grower. It's overwhelming. So what do? They tend to do nothing. And when they decide that the data supports it and it makes sense, oftentimes what we're doing is we're asking them to spend more money. So today, the financial pressures on the growers are unprecedented, right? We all know it, and we know it like the back of our hand. But instead of cutting cost, we're actually trying to get them to invest. It's all about the return on the investment. It's about more net profit at the end of the day, increasing farm profit per acre, and starting to make risk management products and tools that help them manage it at that level. And so that's what we do. We're de-risking the decision. And then if they make the decision to do so, then we all know through our histories that it may take years for a great thing to get rolled out on the total farm. So we're trying to accelerate that adoption. And we do so through some financial instruments and through some guarantees. We're out with the data and we're saying we guarantee that this will occur. And in the event that it doesn't occur, we're talking a language that they understand and they're indemnified. But when it works, it goes across the whole farm. And so it protects them, especially in the US. It helps them with their 10-year average in the federal insurance program. But this resonates whether you're in Ireland or whether you're in Brazil or whether you're in the United States. It's about de-risking decisions. And that's really what we try to do.
I think it's also really important to remember that there's still, with these new technologies and tools, there's a lot that we still don't know. And so it's really important to support research like the soil microbiome. We're just really starting to discover what's happening there. And so Trace Genomics, which is the company that won the Equity Award last year, they're basically doing genetic and genomic fingerprinting of the soil microbes. And it's the amount of data that we're just now starting to gather is incredible, and we need organizations out there that can help translate this data, make it usable for farmers, and really provide that research that's going to lead to the types of innovations that we want.
One of the points I just want to piggyback on what you're saying, Sara. I see it in my dad's side of the family. They're very large farm owners, and I'm a technologist. So here I am coming to that side of the family, and right to Joe's point, I'm like, oh, here's this line of technology, you can use, and there's this gap of education that we've seen, you and I have seen in Bitcoin and blockchain space, right, where you have to educate, and so I think for me it's been interesting to, even though I'm a technologist, but it's to step back and say, okay, great, that's a tool, but to what extent? And then, if that family is risking everything they have, right? Yeah, sure, to a VC firm, that may give a scale, right? But to them, that they need that education. Who's going to educate them, right? And where does the government step in countries where they don't have the protection for the farmers, right? That is a huge problem, right? So you're running into this really a bit of a, schizophrenic system. And I look at my uncle who, let's say, does not want to use any of the enhancements because he doesn't have the right data, right? Nobody came to educate him. So he doesn't want to use any enhancements for the soil, any enhancements for the production. And then his neighbor, who's using all of this, is producing these massive so-called, plastic-looking peppers or whatever, and he's selling at scale, and he's struggling because he wants to produce a completely organic product. And right, so then he says, hey, I'm being put against the wall. I've got to go and use these chemicals and destroy my soil to go ahead and compete with that, because otherwise I can't do it. So it's just this really interesting space that when we look at it, we're in a hard decision to make that monetary decision, right?
And think about what you just said, because that's so powerful. So first, you talk about wanting to do the organic version.
Yeah.
Well, we have a lot of growers today that that see the merits. They want to do that. But then there's economic hardship that comes.
Yeah.
The soil has to be left, unattended, let it go dormant for 3 years. That, how do you keep the family farm in the family if you can't finance these transitional type of practices? So we're on a journey to create tools and indices that would allow us to treat better stewards of the land better. If you don't treat the land well, and today in the U.S., you're charged the same price whether you're a good steward or you're not. And we don't believe that's where the world needs to go. So we're working together to, one, quantify that, but then also help facilitate the transition.
So I've got some questions around the educational piece there, right? So I think, you said something really interesting there. There's the perception that, organic and natural is thereby more sustainable and best. But when you look at water use practices and the amount of land and water it takes to provide food for our population under an organic model, that's actually just absolutely unsustainable, right? So I think there's an educational hurdle that we need to cross when it comes to both producers as well as consumers around what is actually sustainable, what is actually benefiting our environment. And I think, a lot of the messaging out there comes from a place of fear, and it makes it really, really difficult to get the information, the good information that you need to disseminate into the hands of growers and consumers alike. So I'm wondering, if this is the trend that you've seen, Maja, in other countries as well.
Again, we're sitting here comfortably in Miami, right? But when I lived in Africa and doing some of this, I don't know how many of you have worked in these emerging markets year after year. When they have one well, and they're using that to grow their millet, which is the source of their food, and a farmer is going to take that on their back and sell it to some truck that's going to take it back, is going to get $1 for that. That is so far away from where we're sitting right now, right? It's a completely different reality. But yet, we talk about no food in the world, but yet we have all this arable land in the world that we haven't actually made investments to irrigate it and to populate it and to create food or invest in these sustainable practices. And so this is where I, as a person, run into a moral issue of investing, because I see a bunch of VCs in a space who are just looking for that profit margin. Doesn't matter what it is about, right? And then we're going to keep creating and using technology as an excuse that's going to solve a problem, but yet we really could have solved that problem even without a technology if we wanted a long-term investment. But problem is that we are looking for ROI yesterday. So there is a bit of a dichotomy there.
Well, and that's something at least FoodShot is trying to disrupt with this longer capital continuum, providing a longer pathway for more transformative changes. I do think that the education piece for both producers and consumers is important. You can quibble over organic and whether organic is better or regenerative or whatever labels, it's like a Christmas tree for consumers, right? Like they don't know what to choose. But I think we're starting to see new models for actually quantifying savings in carbon sequestration or greenhouse gas emissions. And I think those can be, informative. And I think we also need to think, when you think about scale, it's not enough just to provide that information to a consumer. I think we need to get companies to think about the risk to their own supply chains from climate change and some of the threats to agriculture, and see investing in new production models as actually a key risk mitigant strategy for themselves.
And I think on the educational piece, on the consumer side, while we're seeing that there is a demand for healthier, more sustainable ingredients, what the educational piece that's sometimes missing is that demand needs to translate into a structural change of how our food is produced. So having that visibility throughout and what some of the purchasing decisions imply for the changes could have implications into the ultimate price of the food, and enhance, the ability to price things accordingly across the food system. On the technology side, just to address your point on ROI, I think that's one of the areas that we are focused on, the ROI to the farmer. We see a lot of technologies that are coming to the market with no real, ROI. It's more about the technology than the solution and what it means for the farmer or for the system. So I think one of our criteria is, does this provide ROI to the farmer? And second is this a technology that's, defensible in its own? So to the extent that we can link that technology to sustainability, I think that's our ideal framework for a technology investment.
I think that's the responsible and proper approach to it. I'm wondering what sort of impact policy plays in a lot of this, governmental policy, and how it impacts what you guys are doing, or is that the solution? Who should be educating, creating the policies to enable more ROI for the farmers? Do you guys have some thoughts on that?
Well, I used to work at the Department of Agriculture. I worked there for almost 8 years as a political appointee under the Obama administration. And so I think that, every 4 years there's a farm bill, and it's this massive piece of legislation that has a lot of potential to change practices. And I think when you look at the incentive structure in the U.S. when it comes to crop insurance subsidies and low, artificially low prices for certain inputs, those are things that could have make a big difference. It was actually interesting at the UN Climate Week in New York a couple weeks ago. The leadership from both the Rockefeller Foundation and the World Wildlife Fund said, to their minds, one of the biggest obstacles to real progress and real adoption of some of the innovation is policy. Mm-hmm. I think people, but it's very difficult to change, and the power, the vested power interests are not going away.
Yeah, I would say it's very much driven by policy. We should operate on a minimum at least 2 parallel paths. One, you go through the Farm Bill and through some of the things in the U.S., but you also have the private sector going out, doing what they do best, faster speed to market, generally a high level of efficiency, and then it helps create some policy decisions that will follow after that.
Yeah, I think in general, when we make an investment, we don't like to make it based on a regulation or policy alone type investment. We'd like to make sure that the business model and the technologies can stand on their own, just because while a policy may be enacted, it may take a really, really long time for those policies to actually take effect. I use, for example, there's some very, very harsh chemicals used to treat nematodes, right? That are commonly used in the South in order to enable, production of strawberries and all sorts of great things that we love to eat. Well, those chemicals have technically been, discontinued in use for about 5 to 10 years now. But every year, people get emergency use permits to have them used again, right? So we've decided as a group and politically that this is bad, but by and large, there's still people using them because we need these products out there in order to be able to produce food. So I think those two things go hand in hand. You have the policy leading the way, which creates the environment in which the technology can flourish and be adopted. So,
go ahead, Cristina.
I was just quick tidbit. We're seeing encouraging news. I mean, USDA a few days ago came out saying that climate change is a priority. So I think from where we are, we're excited
They did say that.
They did say that. I feel like that's encouraging. I think we would like to see more of that.
Yeah.
Indeed, it is encouraging when they're also addressing what everybody in the world knows. Right?
I mean, from the organization's perspective, being a focus area is encouraging.
But they've also hidden, I think there's a lot in the last few years that has happened where they've, basically dismantled some of the important research that was going on to climate change. There were these climate hubs that were set up to help farmers adapt to climate change. Those have mostly been left dormant. And so, when you're talking about things that they're actually doing on the ground, it's a pretty tough situation right now, I think, for farmers who are literally dealing, on the ground with climate change and are dealing with an administration where you can't even use the words climate change in a project proposal because that will be immediately discarded.
And maybe I'll take this somewhere controversial, and I don't know what even some of our panelists think. And I certainly don't. I'm known to be a little controversial, you know that. But one of the things that we've noticed, and New York for me is a 16th place in the world I live in, and so that means you're eating the food, you're engaging, and etc. And we all know our bodies really well, right? But when you live in the U.S. and you eat food, and then you go to places in Switzerland, or you go and you live there, or you go in France, right, where agriculture is protected, where chemicals, right, are restricted, and you notice how your body feels, and then you see certain diseases that are in the U.S., and then you see the link of pharma in the U.S. to food and regulation and all your questions about policy. I can't help but have this beautiful conversation about, investing in tech and food and all of this, right? And not following the policy or following the policy. But yet we are deeply in bed with everything else that is quite an interesting web that cannot be isolated, right? One thing cannot be isolated. So I think there is something that at least for us, and when I look at the food I eat here and that I invest in here, and I think to your point earlier, like we also, like when we look at something, we don't just look at policy, but if we isolate the tech and we say tech is going to get there, but yet we don't really care about the health, I'm like, that's just unknown. I just think the VCs in this country hold such a responsibility to healthcare of this country that I don't think they even realize. People like us who invest sit in a seat of a responsibility. So your responsibility is not just to return your money to investor. It's really what are you putting in the mouths of the people of that product you're investing in. So you have to be less greedy, right, and more kind of self-aware about what we're investing in. And this is where you see very different practices if you live in countries around the world. Japan, you can buy plastic and nothing will happen to you from that plastic. You can drink out of that all your life, right? Because they're highly, highly protective about what type of plastic and how it affects your citizens. India, not so much. You'll die probably in 10 years, right? So it's a very important conversation when we talk about this. And I think what I notice a lot on these types of conferences is kind of these isolated things, but this is a complex topic.
No, I think you're right. There is a massive responsibility for VCs, investors, and anybody working on a product, what the effects are moving forward. In maybe a more dystopian future, how are you guys looking at a dystopian future? Would you guys be investing in products that help climate refugees across the states? Like, or are you looking more of, can we make more blueberries bigger, better, brighter, stronger?
So are we talking about like a Demolition Man dystopian future, or like a Brave New World?
Independence Day.
Where on the spectrum are we talking? No, so the reality is, I think we often talk about how much food we need to produce, what we need to do in order to feed everyone, but the reality is most of the food that we need to make in the future is not being made in the Western world, right? Most of the population growth is happening in Africa, Asia, the Middle East. So that's something that we need to keep in mind, right? I think no investor, I hope no investor goes out there writing a check expecting a product to harm consumers and harm people, and willingly writes those checks. For us, when we look at an investment, yes, we want to make money, but making money is not separated from things like social justice, access to food, bettering the world, right? Which is part of why I love ag. There's an opportunity to do a lot of good there. But one thing to remember is that oftentimes nothing comes without a cost, right? So a lot of what we've done in order to produce food, things like fixing nitrogen from the air using energy, or dwarfing our plants in order to kind of stock them more densely in order to produce enough food, that's come as a cost to our climate in the form of emissions, in the form of runoff, in the form of damage to our environment. So I think we can do our best to try and look into the future as to what the impacts we foresee may be and mitigate against those. But if you're asking for a world in which every investment I make has zero risk, well, then I will be the most successful investor in the world, right? And unfortunately, I'm not.
And I think one point to add from our perspective, we invest in technologies and foods that improve the food system. But that being said, we're a very small piece of the puzzle. So a big focus for us is working with strategic partners, with other, with corporations, with others in the system to elevate awareness and elevate the way that they think about the food system and potentially that outcome that you're talking about. So I think we're a small piece of the puzzle. The whole system together needs to elevate to solve some of the issues we're talking about.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to remember is that investment, particularly in food and ag, is a relatively new thing, right? If you look at how much investment went into food and ag, like 5 years ago, it was a fraction of what's going in now. Mm-hmm. So, we're a very small piece of the puzzle. We capture very little capital, but, it's growing. So even as investors, we're still learning about what to look out for and what, makes a good investment in this space.
And
we're over time, and what I like to do on these panels when we're over time, and we're just going to take 10 seconds each to say something positive, like a positive thought about the industry as we leave.
Let's start from that end.
Yeah. Positive thought about the industry in general?
Just a positive thought about...
Just a positive thought? Yeah. Okay.
About, I guess, about where we're heading and what the industry is like. Yeah.
Oh, we're heading to exciting places. It's an exciting time, but we need to be conscious, but we need to embrace the fact that it is a significant amount of change that's getting ready to happen in the agricultural business, not only in the U.S., but across the globe. And the more that we can help ease the pressure on the farmer with the very small, thin margins that are probably here for the foreseeable future, then we have to find a way to help them get attached, get included, work with these great technologies that are going to help us make that next leap.
Yeah, so I think I agree with Joe. It's a really exciting time to be in food and ag. There's a lot of really cool changes and tools that are coming down the line. That's not to minimize all of the challenges we're facing from a climate or sustainability perspective, but I have faith that we'll find a path forward.
I agree. I think we're seeing a lot of collaboration in the space. I think we're seeing more conferences like this one that help elevate and help bring awareness to this space. So I think it's exciting from a collaborative standpoint.
Yeah, I have to agree with Cristina. I'm really excited to be here. I would just say maybe not a positive thought with
keep it positive.
Encouragement. But I love my farmers, right? I'm a farmer. I know how to grow everything and anything, really. I grew up with grandparents, and I've been farming since I was literally 4.5 years old. So I would say all of us should protect those people, that they grow our food, they feed our bellies, they protect our children, and whatever we can do. If you're a VC or a technologist or an operator or a government person, really, no matter what you do, your number one thought should be health, sustainability, supply chain, and does that farming at the end get rewarded?
So there are two things that I'm kind of hopeful about. One is the collaboration and looking, so one of the things, we're doing is not just looking at once the investment happens, but even after the investment, how can we connect companies within our network to supply chain and help them scale more quickly. So the collaboration, I think, is really critical. And then the other is kind of an understanding and appreciation more broadly of the role of food and agriculture in our greater system when it comes to health, when it comes to the environment, when it comes, and it's such a central part of our culture and our lives that I think understanding both the benefits and costs of the benefits of getting agriculture right and the costs of getting agriculture wrong, that's becoming more broadly appreciated.
Let's give a big round of applause to the investment panel.